Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to SNS and today's seminar. My name is Gustav Peldán Carlsson, and I work as a project manager here at SNS. Today's seminar is part of our collaboration with the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University. And the aim of this collaboration is to bring insights from leading international economists into the Swedish policy debate and Swedish context. So we are very glad today to welcome Ekaterina Zhuravskaya from Paris School of Economics, who just flew in today to Stockholm. She's a professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics and belongs to the top 2% most cited authors in the world over the last 10 years. Her research covers a broad range of issues, including everything from the economic effects of the abolition of serfdom to corruption in procurement. But today we're here to talk about the part of her research that focuses on the internet, media, and politics. And we will dig deeper into the political effects of the internet in general, but also fake news and social media in particular. And one of the papers that Ekaterina will touch upon in her presentation is it's a study where she has looked at so-called alternative facts and the role of fact-checking in the French presidential election of 2017. And to shed further light on this, we have invited Alice Petrén, who is a migration correspondent for Swedish Radio, and who has also been based in France as a correspondent for many years. She has also written several books on French politics and society. We've also invited Anders Sundell to join the conversation today. Anders is a senior lecturer at the University of Gothenburg at the Department for Political Science. And he will be able to provide us with some more insights from that field of research. For example, on what we mean when we talk about democracy, and also what the internet and social media has meant for the development of democracy. A very warm welcome to all three of you. As always here at SNS, we have a competent audience, and we encourage you to take part in the conversation, especially during the panel session at the end of the seminar. So please save all your questions and insights for that, and we will bring you into the conversation. If you would like to share what we talk about here today online, you are very welcome to do so. Please use our hashtag SNSkunskap. Then we're very happy. And with that, I would like to welcome Ekaterina onto the stage. Please give her a big round of applause.
Can you hear me? It's okay, yeah. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here in SNS and it's in Stockholm. My daughter was born here, so it's a really very important place for me. But today we're going to talk about political effects of the internet and social media, and I would like to start with three observations and then try to think about how they could possibly be related. And the first observation, which I want to start with, is that we have lived through a true revolution in ICTs, in the information and communication technologies. And to illustrate that, on this graph, you will see how fast over the last 20 years the connection to broadband internet, both mobile and stationary, has increased in developed and in developing world. And interestingly so, the large part of this development was due to the development of mobile internet. And that's what I'm going to focus on a lot today. So, of course, the technology came with the connection to internet. People did get much more connected. And again, we see that the increase is spectacular both in the developed and in developing world. In addition, apart from this connection to internet, which occurred over the last 20 years, we have seen another very important part of ICT revolution in the last 10 years, which has to do with the emergence and spread of the social media. And this graph illustrates how fast the social media has overtaken the world, essentially. Think about, let's say, Facebook alone, which now has 2.3 billion active users, but YouTube and WhatsApp and Instagram are lagging behind, but actually, also catching up quite fast. And we can see that on this graph. So that's what has been happening on the technology side. What I'd like to try to link it to, or at least question whether these things are related, is two trends which we observe, all of us, I suppose, observe on the politics side. In particular, one of these trends is that we have seen a wave of protests. Of course, most notably, they have started with the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011, but then they spread throughout many different countries, both in developing and developed world again, and there are many examples on the slide, but of course you can think about the recent protests in, let's say, Chile, Hong Kong, but also France, what have you. There are many places which see anti-government collective action. That's one political observation. The other political observation is that is not truly global, as with protests of ICTs. It's more about the developed world, and particularly about Europe. What we see today is somewhat a rise in populism. What do I mean by that? Well, this graph illustrates precisely what I mean by that. So this is the share of votes among the European voters, which is cast in the last parliamentary elections of the 30 nations which are counted here, to populist parties. And we see that populists have been on the rise and are rising over the last 20 years. In particular, the largest increase was over the last 10 years, with essentially both populists on the right and on the left gaining. In fact, not only the support for populists has increased, but also more and more people in Europe live under the populist governments. Particularly, according to Guardian, the number of Europeans who live under the populist governments increased over 13 times between 1998 and 2018. So my question today is, are these things related? These political trends and ICT trends? And there have been a lot of arguments that they are very much related. In particular, people have been observing the Arab Spring, about particularly how people have used mobile phones during the Arab Spring, and due to very important work of Diamond and Platter, for example, they branded internet as liberation technology. But at the same time, particularly many political scientists, since the emergence of social media, started to be disillusioned with the ICTs. Particularly, a lot of worries have been raised about the fact that social media are responsible for proliferation of fake news, for encouraging or increasing even political polarization, particularly in the US, but also in Europe, due to the echo chambers. And ultimately also internet and social media have been blamed by observers for the emergence of populist support. So these are pretty reasonable hypotheses, but we do need to see how they, do they find support in the data or not. But before I get to this, what I'd like to say is that there are two aspects of social media in particular, but also the new internet media, which make these hypotheses particularly reasonable. Just for us to conceptually think how social media are different from other traditional media. And the first very important aspect is low barriers to entry. This is unprecedented, how easy it is to come in and create your own, let's say, new media nowadays. What does it do? Well, there are several, and actually quite a lot of different implications of this, but I would like to highlight today two of them. One is that the low barriers to entry allow opposition allow whistleblowers to actually reach out and give the information, potentially damaging for the government information, to voters in the situations where voters don't have other means of getting this information, for example, when traditional media is controlled. That's one important aspect. The other important aspect is that it actually also empowers some politicians who otherwise wouldn't be able to get there, particularly because they wouldn't go through the screening of usual traditional gatekeepers like political parties, for example. Now, a lot of politicians just speak directly to voters without any institutional support. At the same time, the other very important aspect of social media is the fact that it relies on two-way communication. So it's not only media owners speaking to people. It's people can respond and actually signal what they think. And that's very important. Why? Because that eases the coordination between people. In particular, that's important in any type of collective action, and political protests as one of the very important collective actions. Particularly, people like to participate in protests when they know that others will show up as well, essentially. And that's something which social media give the power for people to be able to coordinate. So the question then is, with that in mind, do we really see in the data that these different political trends are related? And here I'm going to just basically tell you a few words about not my own work, my work of other researchers, but it's very, very important, however, because it actually does convincingly show that ICTs do facilitate political protests. First, maybe it's worth noting that there are lots of evidence from all sorts of different studies which shows that protests online and protests offline are very correlated. But that doesn't mean, of course, the causality either way. So in order to document causality, what you need to find exogenous sources of variation, either in the possibility to connect or in the penetration of social network. And there are two studies which do that very nicely. One by Manacorda Tessay, who look at the expansion of 2G internet, not even before the fast internet, before 3G internet, in Africa, in the whole African continent, and showing that actually in the times of economic downturns, the likelihood of protests has increased tremendously with the spread of the 2G. The other study which I want to mention is a study by Nikolopov, Makarin, and Petrova, who study Russia and who show that the penetration, the idiosyncratic variation, essentially, in penetration of the social network, which is the main social network in Russia, which is called Viki, which is essentially Russian Facebook, is very strongly associated with anti-government protests, which were unexpectedly started after the election fraud. So overall, it looks like these pieces of evidence are very much supporting the idea that social media empowers people in places where they have no other ways of protest or to signal their unhappiness to actually go and show that they're unhappy. So, and here, that's now I would like to turn to my own work on that subject. So we took a little bit different approach. We decided to look at the actual government approval. And the good thing about this is that we have enormous amount of data due to a World Gallup poll, which is completely comparable both across time and across space, and it covers essentially the whole world. And we link that to the data on the 3G network coverage, which has been expanding over the last decade. So in particular, here is the map which shows the sample of World Gallup poll for which the expansion of the 3G data are available. And we see here not only the sample, but also the fact that 3G wasn't really available in 2007 when this is the start of our observation period. And it spread a lot to cover about 70% of the world global population by 2018. And we use these data together to try to understand what happens with government approval when 3G comes to a subnational region in a country. And what we show is actually the effects are very, very strong, that once the mobile internet technology comes to a place, the overall government approval ratings fall, and fall by substantial amount, by about 6 percentage points, which is very tangible in terms of rankings. So that's, and importantly, of course, we also show that this is due to the increase in internet use. Yet, this overall result hides a very important heterogeneity between countries, which is shown on this graph, where you would see on the horizontal axis the increase in 3G coverage or 3G share, or the increase of the share of the region covered by 3G networks, and on the vertical axis government approval, we see here the relationship separately for countries which censor internet and countries which do not censor internet. And we see that all of the result comes from the countries which do not censor internet, which tells us, of course, that this is about the content of what people read online. In fact, that is supported by this graph, where we see that in both groups of countries, the use of internet increases with the expansion of 3G. So it's really about content. Then, if we look only among those countries which do not censor content of the internet, what we see is that this effect on government approval is much stronger, and you see that in terms of the slope of these graphs among countries where the traditional media are more controlled by the government. So what does it mean? This means that in those places where people do not have other means to get independent from the government political information, internet plays a very important role in delivering that information. And finally, just in order to pin down this point completely, what I'd like to show you a little bit is the following. We used data which were collected in IMF by Furseri et al., who collected a very interesting data on the actual incidences of corruption globally throughout the last decade. And what we do with this data, we look at how perceptions of corruption by the population are linked to the actual incidences of corruption separately in places which do get access to broadband mobile internet and those who don't. And in fact, we look at within country variations. So what we see is that when there are incidences of actual corruption, they translate into more corruption perceptions among the population in those regions which are connected to internet and are not, or at least to much weaker extent, for those regions which are not connected, which highlights directly these channel of information. So I would have liked to stop here and said, okay, so these pieces of evidence altogether are really, really good news for the world. Why? Because indeed we could say that internet is a liberation technology and it's very powerful and it's working. However, that's not the full story. And I wouldn't be true to myself if I stopped there. And in particular, what the next step in our analysis was to really try to understand whether the other political development which we're observing, the rise of populism, is related to the spread of internet. And in order to do this, we have collected data on elections in Europe throughout the last decade, from 2007 to 2018. And these are parliamentary elections. Altogether in 30 countries, there were 87 of them. And we link the performance of populist parties to the expansion of 3G within Europe. And what do we see? That's what's illustrated on this graph. Unfortunately, I have to report that there is a very, very strong relationship between the political success of populist parties in Europe and the access to internet through mobile 3G networks technology. And this is true for both right-wing and left-wing populists. And the magnitude of the effects is pretty large. I can't say that we're explaining all of the rise of populism, not at all, but still, if we compare a region which doesn't have any access to 3G with a region which has full access, fully covered by the 3G, the difference in the right-wing populist vote share would be 7 percentage points, and for left-wing populists, 6 percentage points. These are pretty sizable effects, let's say. So now, the next point which I want to make here is that if you look at these results and compare them to the results of some other country-level studies, we see essentially that it seems that these effects are driven by social media in particular, because there was a number of country-level studies before 2008, before the social media was present, and there was no relationship between internet connection and the vote for any particular political force. In fact, if anything, the political participation got down with the expansion of the broadband internet. And the researchers interpreted it as follows, that internet provided entertainment and therefore diverted voters' attention from politics. But that effect was temporary with social media, and that is true, that is consistent with our results, but it's also consistent with the country-level studies which have been done in Italy, in Germany, for example, that after the introduction of social media, we do see that voters come back, get again interested in politics, and many of them get attracted by the populist ideas. So now it's worth trying to ask ourselves, so what are the channels? And this is very important. What are the reasons for such a relationship? It's a very important question, of course, but unfortunately the answers here are not as nearly as complete as on the overall effect. So first of all, one should say that undoubtedly some of this effect is due to the general disillusionment by voters from of the, let's say, ruling elite in democratic countries, and some of that discontent is clearly legitimate. However, it can't explain the full story, so there must be something else, and what it is, we don't quite know. We can only hypothesize for now. So there's something at this point, it seems, that which is special about the anti-establishment politicians, which make them, sound more credible on the net compared to the let's say centrist establishment politicians. Of course, that could be also due to the fact that the establishment politicians haven't learned as fast because they are entrenched, but it could also be something special about how the populist politicians talk to the public. So here I would like to right away say that I would like to sort of talk a little bit about the fake news and the false statements which politicians sometimes use. However, and I would like to sort of suggest that these two things might be related, but to this date, there is no really good study which would tell us that populist politicians use false stories more than the mainstream politicians. That seems like a reasonable hypothesis, maybe, to some people, and it does seem to me. However, I cannot say that this is something which has been established. So, however, to the extent that populist is a synonym of irresponsible and not all these studies, all the scholars would agree that these are synonyms, you might think that the use of misinformation has something to do with the story which I'm trying to tell you here. And given that I still have a few minutes, I would like to just before coming to the work which I have done on this area, I would like to tell you a few the few lessons from the overall literature on the subject. So first, talking about the dissemination of false news on social media. The first point to make here is that to this date, again, we don't know whether there's more false news now than it used to be. So there's not such a study which would tell us that, yes, because of the arrival of social media, there is more falsehoods out there. After all, you know, rumors, propaganda, everything is as ancient as politics, let's say. So, however, having said that, there are very important studies which try to document how the false news do spread over social media. And there are several lessons there. First, we do see that dissemination is very wide. In particular, for example, the Alcott and Gensko paper tell us that during the 2016 election campaign in the US, the pro-Trump false news were shared 30 million times on Facebook. It seems quite a substantial amount. However, that's a little bit misleading because it's not true that it was spreading essentially through reaching out to all Facebook users. It seems like the concentration of false news is concentrated among more conservative-leaning and older consumers of social media. So that's the first point. The second point is that if you compare true stories and false stories, it is true that false stories spread faster, go further, more broadly and deeper, and more broadly to a larger number of people, and deeper in terms of if you count how many reshares of the false news were there. And let me skip some. Oh, maybe I should mention, however, a few other bullet points on the slide. That it's interesting also from the existing research. What we see is that Facebook, in particular, was instrumental as an engine of getting people into the false news websites compared to other social media like Twitter, for example. There is not really nothing special about how people browse on Twitter, but if you look at browsing histories of people who get to the false news websites, it turns out that they are very likely to come from Facebook. And of course, you might say, okay, of course this is true because Facebook is so big. But it's not the case for the true news websites. So, in other words, if a person comes to a true news website, he's as likely or she to come from any of the social medias. But for the false news sites, it's particularly the Facebook which brings people there. So, now the question is how these false news propagate. And what we know is something very interesting. First, we see that bots share the false news and true news at the same rate. So if false news become viral, that's due to humans rather than to bots. And also, what we know is that it seems that false news get shared because of its novelty, because it triggers surprise, or because it's very, very emotional. So more emotional news gets shared more. So with that, I'd like to come to the and say basically few sentences. I know we have to finish very soon. About two studies which I have conducted in this regard with my co-authors. We conducted two experiments. One during the election campaign for the European Parliament elections this year. The other is during the election campaign of the presidential elections in France in 2017. And both of these studies, we tried to understand essentially how we can use fact-checking and whether we can use fact-checking to countervail fake news. And here we define fake news in a very special way. So we basically took a real quote from the leader of extreme right party in France, Marine Le Pen, in which she relied in her argument on some false figures. We exposed voters to these statements. We also, subset of voters was exposed to these statements and the fact-checking from the traditional media. And what we find? So the first thing which we find is that fact-checking reduces the willingness to share the news. However, and this is something which is very troubling, what we find is that false news are as persuasive, irrespective of, first of all, very persuasive, and second, as persuasive whether you fact-check them or not. In other words, people turn to vote for Marine Le Pen. A pretty large number of people, 7 percentage points increase was the magnitude of the results. So after being exposed to pro-Marine Le Pen false news, people increase their likelihood to vote for her, and fact-checking did absolutely nothing to undo it. And so my watch tells me that I have 60 seconds to go, so I need to conclude with that. And I hope we will be able to discuss it more. Why we have such an ineffectiveness of fact checking? But I would like to suggest to you now that even though we don't really have the tools to pin down the mechanism of why fact-checking is ineffective, it seems like different pieces of evidence suggest that this is because of the fact that these false news, they are effective because they affect emotional part of voter reaction, let's say. So, and even when people learn that these are false facts which the narratives are based on, they do update on the facts, but the narratives are still they're sunk in the brain of the voters. My watch is telling me that I have to finish so that we can have a discussion, all of us. So let me just try to sum up that. Sort of all of these bits of evidence essentially tell us a few things. One is that it seems that in the developing world, the idea that internet and social media are a liberation technology seems to be consistent with all pieces of evidence. Indeed, it is a very powerful engine of political accountability in places where political information is unfree. At the same time, we understand much less about the workings of social media and internet in developed world. And we need to understand a lot better how and why the voters react to certain political messages in different way. And I would like to open the discussion here. So basically, the punchline of this, maybe you would be disappointed with the punchline, I suppose. But the punchline is that ICTs are a medium, so they are as powerful as the messages which are transferred by their means, and we shouldn't forget about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ekaterina, for an interesting presentation. If you just stay on stage for a little while, and then we'll invite others up later. Was there anything that surprised you, any specific result or outcome when you started to study these topics?
Yeah, I was really surprised about I went very fast through the results about an effectiveness of fact checking. Unfortunately, I don't know if how much of it how clear I was about these results, but these results were very surprising to me. So let me just slow down a little bit. Thank you for asking this question and tell you exactly what we find and why I found it to start with surprising. So basically what we see is that if people are subjected to false news, and in this particular case, this false news were about the refugee crisis. So that was an important issue in the 1917 presidential campaign in France. So we see that they turn to extreme right. But we also see that they turn as much to extreme right if we tell them that the facts are which they just have heard are false. So when we fact check this information, they seem to not at all react to it. So the question is, why would that be the case? Is that because people do not trust the fact checkers? So luckily, given that we were designing the experiments, we could test that. And the answer is not at all. In fact, we asked people what their posterior beliefs about the facts about refugees are. And what we found out is that after people get subjected to false news, they move their beliefs about facts towards false from the control group. But if you subject people to false news and fact-checking, most people, vast majority of people, understand what the true facts are, and they are able to tell us that this is their beliefs. So in other words, the reason for why fact-checking is ineffective is not because people do not trust the facts. So that was the first thing which was very surprising to me, because I'm an economist. I've been trained as in the rational paradigm. So that's something which immediately raises a lot of questions, and we have been thinking about it a lot. And it turns out that we don't know for sure, but it seems that the answer to why fact-checking has been so ineffective in this particular way in undoing the persuasion power of false news is because the answer lies in psychology. So in fact, I already sort of mentioned a little bit in the talk that emotions are a very important part of how false news seem to be working, and people react to them more the more emotional they are. I mean, the more they trigger fear, anxiety, surprise. And unfortunately, so far, fact-checking is not targeting any of the emotions. So when we, at least this is, I think, true in general, but it definitely was true in our experiment. That we were just telling people, okay, Marine Le Pen is lying to you. So because these are the true facts. They learned the facts, but people still remained emotional about the issue. And that was surprising.
Yeah.
I hope that was not too long of an answer.
That's a good answer. We will hear more about that after Anders has presented his remarks on your presentation. So if you have a seat, and please let me welcome up Anders. There's a big round of applause for him as well.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come here and discuss this important topic and reflect some on the excellent research done by Professor Zhuravskaya. This work asks really important questions and answers those questions with rigorous methods, exactly how social science should be done. The studies presented here deal with information. Internet access and social media means that information and disinformation flows more freely. And this can upend the status quo. If that status quo is a dictatorship, it's a good thing. When it is established liberal democracy, less so. But the same has, of course, been true for all new information technology. Radio, for instance, can be used to inform and educate the public or to incite genocide, as happened in Rwanda. It depends on who is talking, as Professor Zhuravskaya said. But what distinguishes the internet from TV and radio is that it allows for multi-directional communication in contrast to the one-way channel of radio or TV. But for authoritarian regimes, freer information flows are by nature a threat. It is so because a dictatorship is a paradox. The few can only oppress the many by convincing enough people to take part in their own oppression. Alone, a dictator is powerless. A dictator's power derives from being obeyed, and even if no one wants to obey, everybody does so because they are afraid of how others will react to insubordination. Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, as they say in Game of Thrones. In the social science departments, we say it's a collective action problem. Divide and conquer is another way to put it. Overthrowing a dictator requires coordination. And in preventing coordination, by keeping subordinates and people in the dark, a dictator can sometimes do the impossible, pull himself up by his bootstraps and remain suspended in the air, held up by an illusion of power. Professor Zhuravskaya's work shows how this situation is threatened by internet, by showing how governments lose support when information starts to flow more freely. But unfortunately, it also shows how this can be counteracted. We saw that when internet was censored, we did not see the same liberating effects. A PhD student that I'm advising, Nicholas Sorak, who does related work, distinguishes between two main strategies for authoritarians to deal with information: chaos or control. Control, by that he means censorship, trying to stay ahead of the curve, restricting the flood of information to a manageable trickle. And China is, of course, the world leader in this strategy and is also exporting this strategy to authoritarian countries by technology and by acting as a model in the rest of the world. Censorship has, of course, always existed in autocracies, and people have always found some ways around it. But what worries me today, what I think it might be new, is how new artificial intelligence technology might change this dynamic. The philosopher Nick Bostrom, in his book Superintelligence, makes the case that the first true artificial intelligence, not just a smart computer program, but actual artificial intelligence, that might develop into a singularity, where the program's intelligence is applied to the task of improving its own intelligence, resulting in an explosion of capacity. And whoever gets there first will have enormous power. Even if that does not happen, most AI researchers think it will do, but even if it doesn't happen, there is a real possibility that the new technology will more benefit the haves over the have-nots, shifting power upwards, away from the people. But if the control system requires enormous resources, the Chinese censorship apparatus employs millions, reportedly. The chaos strategy is an attractive option for the cash-strapped tin pot dictator. Here, the idea is not to take away the threatening information, but to flood it in a deluge of lies, confusion, and misdirection that causes people to question everything, including the truth. And of course, this strategy can also be employed by totalitarian governments. Research by Gary King, Jennifer Pan, and Margaret Roberts shows that the Chinese, in addition to censoring information, they also fabricate social media posts for strategic distraction, not engaged argument, to cite the title of a 2017 paper of theirs. But this can also be done on a shoestring budget, as evidenced by the Russian Internet Research Agency, the so-called troll factory, in relation to the American presidential election of 2016. Here we have an example of a fabricated social media account pretending to be American Republicans, the Tennessee GOP, with 44,000 followers. With social media, anyone can reach a huge audience if the message strikes a nerve, and as we heard, inflammatory and sensational messaging often do. So given how cheap it is and how easy it is, we have to assume that this strategic disruption and distraction now is a part of all authoritarians' toolkits and will be going forward. But in democracies, the most discussed challenge to the status quo comes from anti-establishment populist parties. No longer having to go through channels controlled by traditional media, they now face less resistance in propagating alternative facts, or more simply put, lies. We heard Professor Zhuravskaya talk about how alternative facts employed by Marine Le Pen seem to make an impact regardless of whether they are fact-checked or not. And this is not surprising from a psychological perspective. The Swedish philosopher Åsa Wikfors writes in her book Alternativa fakta, alternative facts, that psychological research have shown that when people are shown information and then immediately afterwards have this information rejected, they still considers this original information and continues to act upon it. Information sticks. And given that for each state of the world there is only one truth and endless falsehoods about that state of the world, the truth, of course, has an uphill climb. It's pretty alone in comparison to the falsehoods. But on the other hand, one can perhaps also see a more rational political explanation for the results that Professor Zhuravskaya talked about here. In their paper, they propose that falsehoods can raise the salience of an issue, and you talked more here about the sort of emotional side of it. But I would like to propose what I think is a perhaps even simpler mechanism, that such statements as the ones by Marine Le Pen signal an intent about policy priorities that voters like without being exactly true. For instance, the statements by Marine Le Pen used in this paper are not correct, but they are also not completely wrong. She says that 95% of immigrants are men, but the fact check says no, it's 58% compared to 17% women. She says that 95% of immigrants don't work, and the true figure is much lower, but unemployment is still twice as high among immigrants as among the native French. Was what I read in their paper. It might be, I don't know if the exact figures were right, but at least in Sweden, unemployment is higher among immigrants. So, and this is of course also the case with Trump, who mixes conspiracy theories, complete fabrications, and gross over-exaggerations. Salena Situ nailed the different ways to interpret this when she, in an article in The Atlantic, wrote that when he makes claims like this, the press takes him literally but not seriously, and his supporters take him seriously but not literally. So Marine Le Pen signals that she thinks that there are too many men among immigrants, and if people think that she is right, what does it matter that the figures are not exactly right? She's telling it like it is. And a recent and absurd episode, again with Trump in the starring role, illustrates different attitudes towards truth, exaggeration, and humor. So first, we see here, just the other day, Trump tweeting out the photoshopped image of him giving the Medal of Honor to the dog that was part of the operation to take out al-Baghdadi, American hero. And second, we see the New York Times pointing out that this is in fact a photoshopped image. And in the third act, we have Eric Trump mocking the New York Times for taking what is obviously a joke seriously. So this illustrates the fact-checker's dilemma. Fact-checking can be dismissed, as it is here, for being too pedantic and humorless. But letting up on the fact-checking, letting go of it, erodes the norm of truth. Trump has, to a large extent, single-handedly demolished the expectation that American politicians should try to tell the truth and that they should be embarrassed when they are caught lying. So where does this leave us? I think, in general, Democrats must welcome the quicker flow of information. If we subscribe to an encompassing thick model of democracy, such as the ones by political scientist Robert Dahl, we want the electorate to be enlightened. People should be aware of available policy options and how it might impact them. Granted, the internet is no guarantee that this information reaches them, but I think we must work harder to make the true information float to the top rather than to restrict information in general. And even if we have a more minimalist conception of democracy, where the role of the people is limited to throwing the rascals out, more information means better opportunity to hold the government accountable, as we have seen here. So the right approach, I believe, is to embrace and celebrate curiosity. News organizations should continue to fact-check, but with a careful watch not to become arrogant or dismissive of certain questions. So in my opinion, some Swedish media and intellectuals, in attempts to stand up for humanism and tolerance, at times during the last 5 years, have at times become too zealous. Several myths about immigration, for instance, that were dismissed and ridiculed, later turned out to have some substance without being completely true. For instance, here we have one example where a Swedish opinion writer says that organized beggary, or he compares it to a famous urban myth of rats in pizzas. And while I think he sticks with his statement here, there have at least been reports where police says that, well, there might actually be some organized beggary going on. Falling off a high horse is more painful, and reversals such as that play well into the rhetoric of populists. A scientific and curious mindset is one that is open to all questions. And this does, of course, not mean that anything goes. For instance, evolution is not just a theory, and man's impact on climate change is well established. But just because that is the case, there are arguments by which conspiracy theorists can be refuted, not dismissed with arrogance. I said earlier that an inherent weakness of truth is that it is only one, whereas the falsehoods are endless. But that is also its strength. Whereas one can get tangled up in lies, the truth is consistent and makes sense. And as scientists and democrats, I hope we can trust it to shine. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Let's please get you all three up on stage now. If we start with you, Alice, should news organizations continue fact-checking, like Anders said, even though it doesn't actually...
Yeah, I think so. I think actually, yes, fact-checking should be done, because at least you have to put a needle in the balloons, the bubbles. I think we've been talking quite a lot about Marine Le Pen here. And actually, she can have all these fake things on internet, but when she's sitting in face of Macron in a TV debate, she's like zero. He's so much stronger, and she loses the race immediately. After 10 minutes, it was over, the whole debate. So when it comes to reality, she had no use of her internet false things. So, and I think we should actually absolutely continue to fact check. Absolutely. I mean, otherwise, what does it lead us to if we just leave these things? You were asked me to bring maybe some examples here, and because I work on radio, so I didn't actually think of these all these nice images. Otherwise, would have shown that to you, of course. But there is an international fact-checking network, and they went over migration things. I work as a migration correspondent for Swedish Broadcasting, so I'm very much into migrants, how migrants are described in media. And the narrative is that they are criminals. And that's what everyone wants to actually prove on all in this fake news. And this international fact-checking network, for example, they went over, this was like a year ago or a year and a half, they went over like 162 news, they picked 162 news pieces, they were all fake. And it showed that 30% were completely fake, just picked here and there, to illustrate that the migrants were criminal. 20% were connected to social benefits, that they were actually taking too much money. And I think that's the two sides of migrants that are always depicted. Either they're criminals or either they are just profiting from the system. That's what they want to do. They have no reason to be here. And they were actually, one other group, for example, went over, for example, a photo picture, 16 photos. Women were all, they were raped, or they had, like, their faces were crashed. And the story was that they were all in Germany and migrants had attacked them. When they actually, this Mimica, an Austrian group, checked that, it was all, none of these women lived in Germany. They were not Germans. They were British or American. And they were raped by their men or by some sort of situation with violence with the police. So there was encounters with the police. So all 16 photos, all these women had nothing to do with migrants, actually. Another story was that a man came rushing into a hospital, and that was also a migrant rushing in and being very abusive. It was 5 years old video, and it was in a Russian hospital, and it was a neurotic, psychotic person. So all these stories are rolling around, and when it comes to migrants, there are so many different stories, and I think it's important to actually sort of break down that they are fake and tell that they are fake. When I was listening to you, I was thinking that you were saying there were low barriers to entry. That also means that it's very easy to open accounts, boot accounts, make a lot of followers. We know New York Times today have a big article on Trump, and very few are actually real accounts. It's a lot of boot accounts. You were saying there are two-way communications, and that means also that comments are easy to enforce. You can always just redistribute the whole time, retweet or whatever. That's a very easy way of doing it. Anonymity is possible. That's also very important to the spreading of fake news. And it's very convenient physically, because you can just sit back in your sofa. You don't have to get out. You don't have to be in Hong Kong and run in the streets. So there are, to be in your bubble and be enforced by algorithm, it all creates a very good situation for you to be a fake news person. And now when you see Trump and you see the people, and they're trying to say, we are the people, we want to rule, he wants to rule, but that neither we the people or Trump wants anyone in between. Parties or media, or, I mean, in a democracy we are a lot of actors and representations and sovereignties and equality, but there is nothing of that. We have a president up there and we have people down there, and they are trying to communicate, and we, the rest, we are not in that race, actually. So that's comments to what you've been saying.
How has the profession of journalism changed as a consequence of this, if you compare it to when you started out your career as a journalist? Is there anything you need to think about today that you didn't have to think about?
In a war, I think the first thing that you lose is your freedom. So auto-censorship is the most important thing to not fall into, to become trying to back. But stand up and fact-check your own things very carefully, and being in my field, migration, which is extremely emotional, but also very complex. I think it's one of the most complex political issues you can deal with today. It means that I really have to look at all sides and be very careful, even with one single word. Migrant, for example, what word is that? Should I say refugee? Those who protect the asylum rights would say you should say refugees and migrants. Others would say you should use something else. So it's a very delicate situation.
Sometimes the term fake news is used to describe both deliberate falsehoods, sheer propaganda, but it's sometimes also used to describe mistakes made by journalists that lead to falsehoods being reported. Trump is doing that, for instance. Is it important to distinguish between these two types of fake news, or what would you say from a political science perspective?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, fake news, as all other hot terms, have become used and abused, so that I don't know really what it means anymore. For me, it used to be fake news articles, like articles that purported to be from a reputable news source, but were in fact complete fabrications. But now, I mean, and that is of course a victory of his. Trump dragged that term into the mud, so now it represents almost anything. So I think it's conceptual clarity is important, and I think we should perhaps be more restrictive with the term fake news and reserve that for these, not just any lie, but the ones that like try to look like news articles from websites. But I mean, of course, distinguishing between mistakes and intentions to deceive is very important. I mean, science is always provisional. I mean, what we think might be the best case today might turn out to be wrong, but that doesn't mean that it was fake news. So yes, I think there's an important distinction.
Could I add to this a little bit? I also believe that the distinction is very important, and I would actually, I don't know, we need to see whether I was careful, but in the academic profession we actually moved away from the term fake news altogether because of Trump, because of misuse of the words. So we use the term false news, and what we mean by this is two things. One is indeed some kind of political actors who try to pretend that they are news agencies, but also politicians who deliberately use lies in order to further their political agenda. So both of these would be false news. So now I just would like to maybe react a little bit on the first question of whether we should continue fact-checking or not. And despite the fact that the emotional reactions are there, irrespective of whether we fact-check false news or not, the fact-checking does the trick, and we document it very, very well, on changing the misperceptions of facts. And that itself actually is very, very important. Because, for example, as far as the situation with the migrants and refugees, if you look at the polls in Europe, that pretty much in every country there are huge misperceptions about the situation. And given that we established that people do trust the media, to established media as far as the facts are concerned, that already has a very important positive role. Of course, there are emotional reactions, but there is a big difference between immediate emotional reaction, be that on social media or be that in front of the interviewer when we do our surveys, and a much more slow response when people think about things like voting, for example, actual voting, going to election booth. So, for example, when I report the results of our study, I am absolutely sure that the results would be much, much weaker if we were able to trace the actual behavior rather than the immediate emotional response. So, to that extent, I'm sure that correcting misperceptions is a good thing, and it's our duty. Maybe, on top of that, we can add the following argument, that apart from just correcting misperceptions, we have to think about how to construct the alternative narrative, which will also sort of resonate with the emotional reactions of politicians. And if that alternative narrative would be positive, that would be part of the solution, and that relates to what Alice said a few minutes ago about the debate between Macron and Marine Le Pen. So essentially, that's what Macron was doing there.
What we're referring to is the TV debate, which is just before a presidential election in France. And up to that, Marine Le Pen was coming with a lot of false statements and saying that his campaign was financed partly by Saudi. He was in very good relationship with the highest ranked person in French television because she would favor his campaign. Actually, she was already there during the Hollande period, but that was one narrative also. But when she came face to face, 2 hours or 1.5 hours, I can't remember how long the debate is, but it's very long actually. She was like, it took very quick. And her people the next day, because I met actually her closest ally, Florian Philippot, the next day, and he was like, well, that was our chance. And it was gone by the debate. Everyone knew she could not win the election because face to face, it was not possible. I think it's a big difference between wrong facts in the paper or at the radio and like false news, fake news, whatever you will call it, because it's not a manipulation, it's a mistake. But actually fake or false news are made to manipulate, and it's a narrative that is going out. And I can see when it comes to migrant, it's the system. It's like someone starts to write something and it goes like there are over 20 tweets in like that, and then it goes so fast, and you can see it's the whole bootings. There are a lot of boot accounts just moving, and that's manipulation. That's something else. It's spin, political spin. It's very different.
Yes. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience. I think there are microphones. Or we can continue talking here. Ekaterina, there was one segment of the 3G paper that I thought was particularly interesting, and it was that people tend to not, correct me if I'm wrong here, when they hear facts about local police, they believe or miss rumors about local police, they tend to believe what they actually see on a daily basis in their hometown more than the false statements about local police or something like that. Could you elaborate a bit on that? Because I thought that was super interesting.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking this. So in this 3G expansion paper, we looked at the government support, but we also looked at other outcomes which we consider as essentially placebo outcomes, where we don't expect to have an effect, or if we did have an effect, that would mean something different in terms of interpretation of our main results. In particular, the first thing which we have done, we looked at the general life satisfaction, because it is possible, of course, that if people get online, they see a lot of negative content, they get depressed, and therefore they may also not like incumbent governments. If that were the case, then it would be completely different interpretation of what we find, but that wasn't the case. So people actually, in general, get happier because they get a lot more entertainment and things like this. So that's one point. The other point which you were referring to, we also looked at the satisfaction with government functions for which people have independent sources of information, particularly for the local governments, where the people directly observe what local governments are doing. And what we see is that connecting to 3G does nothing to alter the approval of local governments. Why is that important for us? Is because that actually highlights the importance of informational content in internet communication. What people are looking for, what people learn via internet and social media. So if they know something already, they don't adjust their attitudes because they see either correct criticism or the false news online, and that's what we see in this result. So when you look at the attitudes towards local government functions, 3G has no effect whatsoever. It's about the overall central government approval which is affected.
And can this be generalized to other contexts as well, would you say? Like, for instance, if you know something about migration, or if you...
That's a very important point, and it's generally true about any sort of persuasive communication. So it depends very much on the prior of the people whom the person who wants to persuade somebody else has. So let me maybe rephrase it to be a little bit clearer. So if people are absolutely sure of facts, then it's much harder to convince them of something else. So that is true in workings of any sort of propaganda or democratic news, or be that social media. And the two things matter. What matters is the belief, so where people are in terms of their policy positions, but also how sure they are in what they believe on. So if they're very sure, then the only thing which could happen with this persuasive communication is either people don't react at all, or if anything, they only sort of update their belief about the issuer of the message. And that actually is another point why fact-checking is very important. Because for some people who know, for example, the situation with the refugees, when they hear the politicians say something which is untrue, what they learn is that the politicians are lying. That's an important piece of information per se. So there are different dimensions of the role of fact-checking there. So I don't know.
So we have one question here. If you please state your name and use the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Oskar Stege-Unger from the Wallenberg Foundations. I wanted to ask you, when you looked at the rise of populist parties in elections, can you tell whether it's all about converting voters who've been voting for a different party before, or actually getting people who usually do not vote to actually vote, and if there is a split between that, and if it tells you something?
This is an excellent question, and I do not have a good answer to this. However, there is a very good work by Campante, Durante, and Sorbio, who look at Italy, case of the rise of five-star movement. In Italy, they show the direct connection of the rise to the broadband expansion, particularly, they look at the fixed internet there. And what they find that it's both, actually, in their case. So indeed, five-star movement actually managed to mobilize some voters which never were political before, but also there was some persuasion effect. So I don't know how much we can generalize on this, and we so far didn't have enough data to be able to answer this question, but it's a very, very important question.
The whole five-star party was an internet party, actually, because Beppe Grillo, he was out campaigning, but I worked as a South European correspondent before, and I was trying to find five-star movement party active persons to interview, and I had to go through internet. And finally I found someone, because they were all mobilized through internet, and they were very inexperienced, which you can see. The Rome mayor, for example, she has. But he went through that.
Yes, one more.
Hi, my name is Marlene Whiteley. I work for the Swedish Council for Higher Education. I'm originally from New York and want to apologize for Trump. I didn't do it, but I feel like I have to apologize all the time. One thing that's very fascinating to me is, we talk a lot about so many emotions are involved in this. And I wonder sometimes if the emotions are for ideologies or ideas, or if they're for a person. Is it about Marine Le Pen? Is it about Trump? Or is it about what they stand for? I think about here in Sweden as well. Do you have anything to say about that, or any ideas about that? Because I think about that a lot.
I mean, I think it's of course different from person to person, but I would think, it's not perhaps emotions for an ideology, because there isn't that much of a coherent ideology in many of the sort of populist parties program. But I don't think it's for a person either, because we see the sort of same trends regardless of the person, even though the person might be an important sort of condition or conduit by which this but this works. But I think it's more about emotions for a feeling of a sort of political feeling that is not an ideology, for instance, the being left behind or not being listened to, or the sort of this tension between elites that do their thing and the common people. I mean, I think in the yellow vest movement, which is picking up these sentiments, I mean, there we don't have an ideology or a person. So it must be something else, I think. And I think it's another feeling, but it's a political feeling, is my speculation.
Time is actually running out, and we unfortunately need to put an end to this very interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Ekaterina, Anders, and Alice, for sharing your insights and knowledge on these issues. And thank you in the audience for coming here today and asking a few questions. Before you leave, I would just like to recommend a paper that SNS released on a topic that's quite close to what we talked about today, especially what you talked about, Anders. It's unfortunately only available in Swedish, but for those of you who speak Swedish, you can download it on our website, or I think there are actually some physical copies of it outside here, printed ones. It's written by David Strömberg, professor of economics at Stockholm University, who you can see presenting the report at this very position a year ago. Thank you for today, and very welcome back to SNS in the future.